Good evening and welcome. My name is Tracy Johnson, and I have the honor of serving as the Dean of Life Sciences here at UCLA. I'm also a professor in the Department of Molecular, Cell, and Developmental Biology. My lab studies how genes get turned on and off at the right place at the right time to carry out for cells to carry out their proper functions. During my tenure as dean since the fall of 2020, I've really had the pleasure of highlighting the amazing research and the wonderful accomplishments in all of the departments within life sciences. And so today, I welcome you to our Let's Talk Science lecture series, which is hosted by the Division of Life Sciences. And this is an opportunity for us to highlight UCLA's research expertise on today's most urgent challenges. We look at critical scientific questions from all perspectives represented within the division. So today, at a time when discussions of reproductive biology have really been driven by politics, we wanted to tackle these important questions from the perspective of scientists, from the molecular and cell biology to the physiology and to the social sciences. So I'd like to first share just a little bit about our division to put us in context. It's the Division of Life Sciences at UCLA, which has grown to be one of the largest academic homes for undergraduates of any school or any division at UCLA. Our students have the opportunity to do cutting edge research and work in labs with world-renowned scientists at a top research university. Our faculty are developing new vaccines, new ways of treating chronic diseases like cancer, like immune disorders, like sickle cell disease, and they're addressing pressing needs such as disease tracking, vaccine development, and trying to understand how to grapple with the change of climate and that effect on our environment. So this is just a taste of some of the research that we do in life sciences. But a common theme is that our faculty and our students share the goal of using science to solve today's most urgent challenges. So recognizing the importance of reproductive science to human health and well-being of society, UCLA has established a new center that I'm excited to showcase here tonight. It's the Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education. And its goal is to serve as a unique national and international home for research, training, career development, and public outreach, all around topics related to reproductive science. In today's event, Conversations about the Future of Reproductive Health, you are going to hear from some of the leaders in our new center and learn about major scientific research themes of a national and international perspective and importance. The societal aspects of this field and the groundbreaking work addressed tonight and will touch on some of the impacts of environmental exposures on reproductive health today and for future generations. So this evening, you're going to hear from 3 of our esteemed professors who will then have a discussion about their research and its implications. And following their discussion, I'll join them and pose some of your questions that were previously submitted. So we look forward to taking additional questions from the audience, which you can submit through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to submit questions at any time, and note that the chat function is turned off. So any questions that you submit will have to be submitted through the Q&A. So our hope is that today's event is not only enlightening for you, but also sparks conversation. And we encourage you to take what you hear tonight and use it to make a difference with the knowledge that you gain. So it's my pleasure first to introduce the 3 faculty who will be speaking with us this evening. First, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Amanda Clark. Dr. Clark is an esteemed stem cell scientist, geneticist, and developmental biologist. She's internationally recognized for her beautiful work on germ cell and in vitro gametogenesis. Dr. Clark is a professor in the Department of Molecular, Cell, and Developmental Biology, and she's the inaugural director of the Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education at UCLA. She's the president-elect of the International Society for Stem Cell Research, a global nonprofit that promotes excellence in stem cell science and applications to human health. The Clark Lab seeks to use stem cells and regenerative medicine approaches to understand the science of human reproduction and fertility. Dr. Clark's work has been recognized by awards from the International Society for Stem Cell Research, Stop Cancer, the Lance Armstrong Foundation, and the Concern Foundation. She was recently awarded the Founders Medal from the Australian and New Zealand Society for Reproductive Biology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Clark.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk about my own research, to discuss with my colleagues their research in the reproductive sciences, and to let you know about a little bit more about the initiative that we've created on the UCLA campus in this area. So I'm going to share my screen and almost there. Okay. So I'm going to talk about reproductive science, health, and education. So when you think about reproductive science, what is it that comes to your mind? If you're thinking about the science of having a baby, the science behind healthy pregnancies and pregnancy outcomes, the science of gametes, of eggs and embryos and assisted reproductive technologies, you would be right. That actually does form a very big part of the reproductive science platform. But reproductive science is so much more than the science of having a baby. It's also the science behind the reproductive tract and its associated reproductive organs, the ovary and the testis, as well as diseases that affect these reproductive organs. For example, testis cancer, ovarian cancers, prostate cancers, fibroids, the prostate cancer, polycystic ovarian syndrome, ovarian failure, endometriosis, and the list goes on. Millions of people around the world suffer from reproductive diseases, and reproductive science can make an impact in the way these diseases are managed and cared for. In addition to the science of the reproductive tract, reproductive science also includes the science of organs and tissues in the brain, and these include the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And these tissues and organs produce chemical signals called hormones that act on these reproductive tracts and ovaries and testes in order to ensure their normal functioning, and also our overall wellness and our sexual health. Reproductive science also includes the science of puberty, the science of contraceptive discovery and the discovery of new contraceptives that have less side effects and contraceptives that are reversible in men. Reproductive science also includes the science behind healthy reproductive aging, how to slow reproductive aging, and potentially how to reverse the reproductive aging process. Reproductive science also includes the science behind issues that are unique to the LGBTQ+ community and their reproductive care and the assisted reproductive technologies that enable them to have a family. Social science is also extremely important to the reproductive sciences, and this includes reproductive psychology, as well as the impact of reproductive science on society and the impact of society on the reproductive sciences. So overlaying all of this is the way the environment impacts these different reproductive organs and tissues and the health of the reproductive system. And you're going to hear more about that today as well. Given how important reproductive science is to our own health, our parents' and our children's health, as well as the health of society, you would imagine that there are lots of opportunities to learn about reproductive science through the educational pipeline. Unfortunately, in the US, this is actually not the case. I'm going to take a few moments to talk about this. So in middle school and high school, reproductive science is introduced usually through a comprehensive sex education program. But you may not be aware that only 38 states plus the District of Columbia mandate sex education in middle school and high schools. But perhaps even more important is only 17 states require that sex education has any grounding in medical education, and to me, what that means is any grounding in scientific knowledge. At the undergraduate level, there is some reproductive science that's included in a 4-year university curriculum. Usually, it's perhaps 1 lecture or 2 lectures in a lower division class a class that talks about the reproductive system. Perhaps we'll discuss the hormones produced by the brain that then act on one of the reproductive tissues that then feed back to the brain, and that's about it. So reproductive science is really introduced during graduate education and primarily as part of medical school curriculums. But not everybody in the US can go to medical school. And so therefore, reproductive science is really only provided to a very small part of our society. Of the studies that have been done on graduate education, it's clear that there is some graduate education in reproductive science at the master's level. And this peer-reviewed publication in 2022 managed to uncover 15 programs across the United States, and this is the states where they're located, where there's a master's program in reproductive science. Of these 15 programs, most of them are masters in animal sciences, so they're tied to a veterinary college. And of the number that are found in medical schools, they are associated with reproductive health and biology, usually of one sex. So given this, UCLA had the foresight, and particularly the Division of Life Sciences in the college, to create a UCLA Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education to meet this unmet need in creating a center that studies reproductive science, not just in one gender, but across the lifespan and across all lived genders. The goal of this center is threefold. So there are three main pillars. One is to support excellence in reproductive science research, and this is research in the biomedical sciences, as well as reproductive science research in the social sciences. The second pillar is to create opportunities to engage students in undergraduate education in the reproductive sciences, starting earlier in their career in the lower divisions, and then creating opportunities in the upper divisions for them to explore specific topics and areas in the reproductive science. This also includes engaging students, not only undergraduates, but also our fellows, our postdoctoral fellows and our clinical fellows in cutting edge reproductive science in labs so that they can move the needle on reproductive diseases and improving reproductive health and wellness for all. And then our third arm of our center is our public engagement arm. That's engaging with you, the public. This includes having webinars where we can talk about reproductive science and answer your questions. It also includes going out into the community and talking about reproductive science to increase literacy in the reproductive sciences. So when policies are made that impact reproductive health and wellness, science has a place at the table in these conversations, and the general public understands what it means when policy decisions are made around reproductive health. So I just want to spend 1 minute talking about my science. So I am a reproductive scientist. I am also a stem cell scientist as well. And we use stem cells to build reproductive organs in the laboratory. The reproductive organs we build are ovaries and testes. We use these laboratory-made reproductive organs to understand the scientific basis of fertility and infertility in order to empower new choices in family building. We also use these technologies using stem cells in contraceptive discovery. And so this can enable reproductive choice. So just to give you an example, this is an example of a little miniature ovary that we created in the lab entirely in vitro, growing inside our incubators at UCLA. In blue, these little circles are oocytes that are derived from stem cells that we've made in the lab. And the surrounding areas are the tissues that support these growing oocytes. So if you're a student of mine looking down the microscope, you can actually see these oocytes at higher power, and you can see they're still blue. So this is because there's a reporter in them telling us these oocytes originated from stem cells. And we can see in this self-assembled ovary that the oocytes are forming normally, that they are surrounded by supporting cells, which will nurture these oocytes to grow and mature and to progress towards ovulation through a process known as follicular genesis. So this is what science looks like in a biomedical research lab. And these photographs were taken by Dr. Anne Le Goff, who's a social scientist, who's a postdoc who works with Hannah Landecker, who's going to talk next, and also studies the research that we do in the lab at UCLA. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the next follow-ups in our conversations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. Next, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Hannah Landecker. Dr. Landecker is a historian and sociologist of the life sciences with a particular focus on cells, biotechnology, and metabolism. Dr. Landecker is jointly appointed as a professor in the Department of Sociology and the Institute for Society and Genetics, an interdisciplinary unit that's committed to cultivating research and pedagogy at the interface of life and human sciences. It's one of the wonderful things about UCLA that we have so many areas of excellence, that there's this beautiful integration of disciplines to answer really big, important questions. Dr. Landecker also co-directs the Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education. Dr. Landecker's research helps us understand both the past and the present and the future of biotechnology using tools of social science to understand the broader impacts of what we do in the laboratory. She's the author of Culturing Life: How Cells Became Technologies, and has written widely on the role of film in public understanding of biology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Landecker.
Thank you very much. I'm also delighted to be here and to be sharing some thoughts on the social side of our new center. So I also am going to share my screen here. And we will launch here into talking a bit about reproductive health, science, and society. So I was talking about the fact that we often, when we're thinking about the biology of reproduction, we often talk in universals about how we all have cells and we all have genes and we all have reproductive systems, whether we're 1, whether we're 80, whether we've had children or will have children or will never have children. This is a shared facet of our humanity. So given this apparent universality of our basic biology, you might not expect social change or historical events to have much impact on the kind of fundamental bench science that Dr. Clark was talking about in her short presentation. And in fact, people often think the reverse, that basic science has to be translated into medical or technological applications that then have an impact on society, sort of like a meteor hitting a surface. But of course, the social trends and attitudes of society really work to frame our knowledge, and the questions that we think are important enough to fund research into, and what we prioritize in terms of teaching the next generation of researchers and clinicians. So this is the kind of research that I do. I ask how society is changing the nature of the very science that we do, and how social problems and historical events shape our questions and our findings. So what I'd like to do with my few minutes is point out some of the ways in which we're actually living in pretty momentous historical times for reproductive health and reproductive health science. And of course, your mind probably automatically goes to Supreme Court decisions and new reproductive technologies, but I'll invite you to think at an even bigger scale than that. So I'm talking about things such as the changes in the very age structure of our population and our society, evident in charts like the one that I have in front of you here on the screen from the CDC, which is showing a really extremely generationally short shift in the age at which women are having babies. So the blue number at the top shows you the birth rate per 1,000 women, which has been going down since 1990. But I think what's more significant is that you can see this really profound shift in the age at which women are having children, and especially a shift to having children over 35 or over 40. Now, I would show you the comparable data for men, But it turns out that the Census Bureau only released its first report ever on men's fertility in the United States in 2019. So I can't show you the 20-year trend. And I think this nicely illustrates the fact that our social attitudes really do profoundly shape scientific inquiry all the way from the beginning. So traditionally, the study of fertility and reproduction has been assumed to be about women of reproductive age. And sometimes that closes down the lens of who and where we're looking in asking for data. So despite this hole in data collection, we do expect to see similar trends towards parenting at later ages in men as well. And so this sweeping change in the timing of parenting in the lifespan is, of course, of enormous social and biological consequence, but it's also of great scientific consequence. And it is revealing all that we don't know actually about reproductive health over the lifespan. Another super momentous change specific to our time, our historical moment and our generation, is a growing realization that questions of medical outcomes and the health of individuals is inextricably linked to the health of ecosystems, and questions of socioeconomic and racial equity under conditions of climate change and industrial pollution, as we'll hear about a little bit more in Dr. Allard's presentation. So the environmental movement and an allied but somewhat separate reproductive justice movement have intersected recently in the realization and the insistence that reproductive justice entails the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. So the lived experience of environmental inequality and its specific effects on fertility, child development, and reproductive system health through the lifespan is a reality for many communities. So these social movements play a growing role in the visibility of reproductive health inequality, not just as a social problem out there in our cities, but as a necessary element of medical care and of research design at this fundamental bench level as much as out there in the cities. So to harken back to my previous example, we might see at a population level that women and men are having babies at later ages, but there are pressing research questions to ask about the intersection of aging and things like climate change. As scientists right here at UCLA have shown, even at a molecular level, our biological age can differ considerably from our chronological age. And so to put it plainly, having babies later in life is simply not a level playing field. It's important that our basic sciences step up to help understand and create solutions to these problems as they're experienced and lived. So to sum up, we can't just sit around and assume that the science will just happen, nor that it will just happen in a way that responds to the needs and problems of a very diverse constituency. I think that one role for the social scientist at the table is to help basic scientists or fundamental bench scientists make not just the bench to society translation, what is sometimes called the bench to bedside pipeline, when people are talking about the development of therapeutics, but really to understand the society to bench direction as well, to be reflexive and inclusive even at the stage of research design. So this includes the three kinds of things I put on the screen here. It's to notice the questions that we're not asking and ask whether there are social reasons or prejudices behind underinvestment in something like endometriosis, which affects no less than 10% of women in our population, and yet has remained relatively underfunded. We can ask with scientists such as epidemiologist Ami Zoda, can we do an intersectional bench science? Can we look at the intersections of aging, stress, and toxin exposure as they meet at these cellular and molecular mechanisms of resilience, such as DNA repair? Can we really prioritize and put on the table and put at the center molecular and cellular determinants of reproductive health inequalities? So those are all the things that I think that a social scientist at the bench working together with these amazing colleagues at UCLA can contribute. So I think this will make a really nice transition into listening to Dr. Allard, who will talk to us about some of the environmental factors being studied in terms of reproductive health.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landecker. And I think that is a wonderful transition to our third speaker, Dr. Patrick Allard. Dr. Allard is an associate professor and vice chair of undergraduate education in the Institute for Society and Genetics. His work resides really at the intersection of genetics and developmental biology and environmental health. So some of the kind of questions he asks is, can environmental exposure early in life affect health years later? Can our health also be determined by what our ancestors were exposed to? Those are just a few of the questions that Dr. Allard's lab attempts to answer by developing and using state-of-the-art integrated methods to examine the impact of environmental and chemical exposures. And his research on the reproductive and transgenerational effects of environmental chemicals has been published in high-profile journals and has been recognized by many awards and grants, notably from the National Institutes of Health, Burroughs Wellcome, Innovations in Regulatory Science, an award to recognize extraordinary leadership and scholarship, and a Templeton Foundation grant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Allard.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dean Johnson. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you should be seeing the right screen. So to frame the scale of the problem that we are trying to address in the lab, I'd like to start with what are probably some pretty sobering numbers and statistics. It's estimated that, oops, sorry, let me step back. It's estimated that in the US alone, there's about 80,000, probably more, probably closer to 100,000 different chemicals that have been authorized for use, and that worldwide, this number could grow to 230,000 chemicals or mixtures of chemicals that, again, authorized for use, and therefore a large number of these chemicals are present in our environment. Of these very large numbers, the EPA has only thoroughly tested a very small fraction, about 350, and the CDC monitors about another small fraction, about 400 chemicals on a regular basis in the human population. Unfortunately, this is not enough, and many chemicals, many more than 400 chemicals, probably closer to 600 or 1,000, have been detected in various fluids, body fluids like amniotic fluid, cord blood, or breast milk, telling us that the fetus or the newborn babies are exposed to this chemical soup that we've generated over the years and that we unfortunately bathe in on a regular basis. And so how come we are facing these kinds of numbers and that situation? That's because, of course, over time, we've become incredibly dependent on the chemical manufacturing industry. And so we're surrounding ourselves with these chemicals. And I'll just give you two categories of chemicals to think about. The first one are plastics and the chemicals that make up a plastic, and the fact that we are extremely accustomed. I invite you to look around you right now, but we are extremely accustomed to living with plastics. I'll give you one example, one short story about one of those plastic components, bisphenol A, or BPA for short, which is found in a plethora of consumer products. Baby bottles used to be made of this component of plastics, BPA, until 2012, when the FDA finally did a rule by abandonment, as it's called. So anyway, ruling out that BPA could not be used in baby bottles. And the concern behind the use of BPA was of a reproductive nature. that it could interfere with the production of healthy oocytes, healthy sperm, and eventually healthy embryos. And so because of this ban, we saw the emergence of BPA-free products that usually have this little green label with a little leaf that gives you, I would argue, a false sense of safety. And the reason why I'm saying a false sense of safety is because in reality, what the manufacturing industry has done is replace one type of bisphenol, bisphenol A, by chemicals, other types of bisphenols that are so similar in structure that they can be used exactly the same way in the manufacturing pipeline, really begging the question as to whether we're in a safer spot by having BPA-free products compared to BPA-full products. The second category of chemicals that, of course, is important to talk about are pesticides. We've become incredibly dependent on the use of pesticides in the agricultural industry, and in particular in California. 20% of the total amount of pesticides used in the US are used in California. It's over 200 million pounds per year are used in California, in particular in the Central Valley of California. And so unfortunately, that leads to reports like this one of a resident in the Central Valley of California describing how when she was very young, 17 years old, as she lived and worked in that Central Valley of California, she witnessed a plane spraying a particular pesticide called chlorpyrifos onto workers who were working in the field. They didn't wait for the workers to be a way to spray that pesticide. And unfortunately, some of them were women and all of them lost their babies. Years later, this resident herself had a son who was born with cognitive impairments and ADHD, and she was really sure of the culprit, that it had to be this pesticide, this organophosphate insecticide, chlorpyrifos, that damaged her son's brain. So why are we in this kind of situation? Why do we keep on putting out chemicals and then years later, through decades of epidemiological studies, realize that indeed they alter reproduction? I think this is a very complex problem that probably requires a much lengthier and complex answer. But I think one of the elements of the answer is the fact that reproduction is, as a biological process, incredibly complex and unfolds over a very long period of time. This is the human life cycle. These little circles here are actually the very early stages of human embryos. And within those human embryos, within just the first few weeks of life, you start to see the emergence of cells that eventually, more than a decade later, will give rise to the mature sperm and oocyte. So with a process that unfolds over such a long period of time, how can you dissect every single stage of this long process and figure out whether it's indeed sensitive or not to environmental exposures? So facing this kind of situation, what I dedicated my young career, I would argue, at UCLA is to use different kinds of model systems. You can see a worm slithering through the screen. It's a well-known model in genetics, and decided to apply it for the question of toxicology. Also deriving and applying stem cell models. One of the leaders of using stem cell models to study reproduction is Dr. Clark, who spoke before, and that was a big draw for me to join UCLA. So using these models, we were able to show, we were actually one of the first groups to show that these BPA substitutes, including bisphenol S, are not safer. They alter reproduction in a different way, but the ultimate result is as bad as BPA, leading to germ cells that are not healthy and embryos that end up dying at a much higher rate. We also show that there's a legacy of exposure to BPA over several generations that ultimately leads to defective reproduction for several generations through a mechanism called epigenetics. We are lucky at UCLA to also be experts and therefore to be called on as scientist experts by various organizations, including the California Environmental Protection Agency. And this is me here at the back, after having read hundreds of pages on chlorpyrifos and ruling for California as part of a panel, unanimously and independently coming to the same conclusion that we should ban chlorpyrifos in California. And California and Hawaii were the first states leading the charge on this, banning the use of chlorpyrifos in California, which ultimately paved the way for EPA, the federal EPA, to eventually ban chlorpyrifos as well. So I'd like to conclude just by saying that we're lucky to be at UCLA and to have this new center coming online for reproductive science, health, and education, because we need more of these bridges between scientists, educators, legal scholars, and of course, outside partners, clinicians, etc., to be able to tackle the really large problem that we have of connecting the breadth and number of environmental exposures and reproduction. And I will end there.
Thank you, Patrick. That is so wonderful. So to our audience out there, who normally attend the Let's Talk Science events, we're going to have a little fireside chat type conversation just for a little bit to get the questions going. And then we're really excited to start addressing your questions. And that's when Tracy will come back on. So, so I'm actually going to begin by asking Patrick a question. And then I'm going to turn it around and ask a very similar question to Professor Landecker as well. So Patrick, what do you see as one of the most important impacts biomedical science can have on the future of reproductive health care?
Yeah, well, I think it's several-fold. I think as a toxicologist, as someone who studies the effect of the environment, we need basic researchers to really understand and dissect the biology, because we cannot understand what the environment is doing on the biology if we don't understand the biology first. So for me, this, again, basically what you're doing, but what other people are doing across the country is really, really foundational, so that we can have a chance at all to understand what the environment is doing to the process of reproduction. Related to that, I think it's providing tools. I try to highlight that in my talk, but it's such a complex question. It's as complex as the brain is. It's a lot easier, I would argue. Perhaps people would disagree, but I think it's a lot easier to study brain function than it is to study reproduction. And then again, once we have these tools, then we can try to really leverage them to understand. I think one of my driving questions that is of high interest to me, at least, is what are the critical windows of life where these exposures can come in and really put you on a trajectory that you can't perhaps recover from. So again, if we understand the biology, if we have the right tools, then we have a chance of dissecting that.
So before I move to Hannah, I just want to ask you one question. Well, what is the tool that the EPA uses currently to test those 300 chemicals? Is it anything to do with a reproductive cell or organ, or?
They have a reproduction assay. It's actually what is called they have different types of assays, but it's using rats, mice, dogs, and monkeys. It's usually a two-species approach to reproduction. There's no way you're going to get to the 80,000 or the 100,000 chemicals. And there's also, one can think about the ethics of using animals in research as well, to at that kind of scale, right? So yeah, there are assays to test the reproduction. We just look at how these animals reproduce when exposed to different doses of a chemical, but this is just too slow, and we can't get to, again, the magnitude of what we're facing in the environment.
Thank you. So Professor Landecker, same question to you. What do you see as one of the most important impacts social science research can have on the future of reproductive health?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways to answer that question, but maybe I'll piggyback on Dr. Allard's answer there. And I think, I think scientists today are facing an enormous challenge, in the sense that when I look at, developmental biologists back in 1915 or 1930, they really thought that they were just studying nature. and it was the secrets of nature. They were out there to be discovered. You just did the science and you would figure out how cells worked, how genes worked. It was this relationship of the scientist to nature. But these days, we have to figure out not just nature, but nature in the context of all of this human activity, all of this human industrialization. We have to figure out nature in the context of regulatory change. We have to figure out nature really shaped by social trends and attitudes and those kinds of things. So I think, the collaboration where you have the people who really understand how human life is kind of formatted by institutions and our social ways of being, and how that relates to what's in the dish or what's in the clinic or those kinds of things. This is a space where collaboration is really needed, and science has changed with the world, and really understanding where we're located in society and history. I think that will make for better science.
I think that's really interesting. Perhaps that we as scientists don't communicate well enough with the general public, our communities, about the process of science, and that a scientific discovery is made and that we get new information, and it means that what we think might have been a scientific truth a year ago actually turns out to have only been part of the story, and now we've learned something new, and it actually changes the way we think about a problem, and we don't communicate that very well to society, and so it's hard for society then to understand what we do. I think a great example probably is in COVID, as the information of science started to change, which we as scientists all understood. It was hard for the general public to understand why is science changing? Why are you changing your mind about decisions that science is telling you? So
but it's tough to do that. I mean, you just presented it in the context of reproductive science not being sort of a hole in the education starting really early in life. So it almost sounds like we should have more of the high school, perhaps even middle school programs where we can come in and start to infuse some of that knowledge early on, so that at least perhaps later on we can explain more complex issues, right? Otherwise it's really tough to communicate all of this at any point until grad school, I guess.
Right, exactly. And I have two, a middle schooler and a high schooler. And so when I talk to them about what are you learning about in school when it comes to sex education and reproductive science, it's not a lot. So of course they hear a lot about it at home from me, and so they have that opportunity. But yeah, I agree. The way we talk about science and reproductive organs really needs to change. So, Patrick, I noticed from your presentation, you talked about chemicals in amniotic fluid and breast milk and cord blood. Is there a particular chemical in there that you want to tell us about?
You want me to pick one out of 80,000 chemical? I think it's right. I think it's tough. As researchers, I think we all have sort of, our interest going to different families of chemicals, but there's just so many of them. Some of them that have been of increasing concern over the years are it's a family of chemicals as opposed to one particular one, but these endocrine disruptors. So I mentioned one of them, bisphenol A. There are others called phthalates that you find in a plethora of cosmetic products still to this day. And the way that they work is it's so insidious, right? They can perturb subtly, but over time end up having this rather detectable and large effect on reproduction, again, over a long period of time, even at low doses. So there's a whole family of them. We keep on discovering them, new ones. And so these endocrine disruptors, I think, are particularly concerning. The other, I could go on forever, but I'll just mention another class of chemicals that people are talking a lot about now. They often, in the news, you may see them referred to as forever chemicals. They're called PFAS. It's it's per and polyfluorinated substances. Some of them are legacy chemicals that stick in the environment for decades. The newer generation of these chemicals don't stick around for as long, but they have very broad effects on the entire body, including on reproduction. And even though they're not forever chemicals per se, they do stick around in our bodies and the environment still for a long time. They are found absolutely everywhere. There's thousands of them. And we're just at the beginning of understanding what they do. So it's a very large question, and many researchers now investing in those PFASs.
So we'll stay tuned.
Yeah.
So, Professor Landecker, I'm curious on what your thoughts are of why you think fertility and reproductive health is often framed as a woman's issue. You brought that up in your presentation. I thought I'd touch on that one again.
Well, in a lot of ways, everybody will be able to answer that. Sometimes the dominance of having babies and pregnancy and the figure of that happening in women's bodies, and that being the center of the discipline of obstetrics and gynecology. I mean, it all tends to focus in on pregnant women. But in many ways, as you yourself underlined, I think one of the things that we really need to push against is this sort of idea that this is a reproductive system that's tucked away somewhere in just one part of life and in one segment of the population. And so really at the same time, including the whole male half of the population in the questions that we ask about reproductive health, but also at the same time saying, well, look, we have for decades been doing research where we exclude women or pregnant women from studies. So there are data holes everywhere in some ways. And one of the ways to really push back against that, I think, is reframing. The reframing for whom these questions are being asked, reframing the sense of where reproductive science belongs in some of these really pressing questions. That it's, and also that it's not just in the body, that as I was saying, that we have to think about things that researchers even here at UCLA in the Institute for Environment and Sustainability have been pointing to, that rising temperatures have all of these intersecting effects with human bodies at different stages of life. So I really hope that this is one of the things that the new center can do, is expand out our sense of for whom reproductive health is relevant.
What a wonderful transition. Thank you so much for that fireside chat. I really enjoyed hearing the discussion between all of you. And I have the honor of framing some of the questions that we received before tonight's event, as well as some fantastic questions that are coming in on the chat. And so I'm going to start with really a question that about the center itself and its scope. For example, there are questions about whether the new center is going to interface with the UCLA Department of OB-GYN. For one, there's interest in whether the center will look at questions around HIV and STIs, broadly thinking about sexual health. And then there's this wonderful question in the chat about, and I think it sort of touches on some of the things that Dr. Landecker started the discussion with, understanding, some of the social reasons why folks are delaying childbirth and starting families that may be related to economics and sort of some of the other social pressures. So the question is, will the center address this variety of topics and how? And I'll turn it over to you first, Dr. Clark, as the new director.
Thank you, Dean Johnson. I'm so excited to get that question. So the answer is yes, 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 yes. And what it highlights is that, you know, conversations around reproductive science and the intersections of reproductive science with the environment, with thinking about translating science from bench to bedside, so interactions with medical schools, are really, really important in this science getting out into society. And so the only way it can be done is at a comprehensive tier one, #1 public university, I should add, in the country, that is UCLA. And in a collaborative environment that is UCLA. So the center is a cross-campus, it's a cross-campus center that has members from not just the college and life sciences, but across the campus, including members in the Department of OBGYN. And I'm actually really delighted to announce that we'll be offering student fellowships for performing research in labs in collaboration with the Department of OBGYN coming up in the future. And so that's one of our exciting initiatives that we're going to start with. But yes, being able to think about reproductive science in the context of economics is extremely important. And a great example of that is who has access to assisted reproductive technologies. And the answer is not everybody. And so it's really important to understand, how did we get here? Because new reproductive technologies are being developed in the labs now at UCLA and around the world. So we want to make sure that access to these technologies is inclusive. And so there's lots of areas that we want to be engaged in. And so how are we going to do it? By being very visible, by being a home for people to come to through seminar series, through connecting faculty on science who wouldn't normally talk to each other because they are in different locations or they're in different disciplines, but to create these opportunities for connections and to fund those opportunities so that they can be realized into actionable items. So that's how I'll start.
There was a wonderful question in the chat that you answered that both came in online and in the chat. Will there be opportunities for undergraduates at UCLA and undergraduates generally to have research opportunities in the center? And I think that clearly clearly the answer to that question would be a yes.
Yes, absolutely. We want to engage students, but we also want to try and figure out how we can create students that are, that are cross-trained, across disciplines. So not just being in the lab and learning how to do stem cell biology as it relates to reproductive science, but how does the work we do actually impact society, or the work we do, how can we think about it in the context of a changing climate and environment? So.
And I think the next question relates, I think anyone can answer this. The question is, how are, there's so much rich discussion that's come up tonight. How is this possibly being disseminated outside of the university? For example, in public schools, in the community around Los Angeles. How are you thinking about that sort of dissemination? I think Dr. Allard, some of the questions that you're raising really touch on communities around Los Angeles who may not have access to the sort of studies that you're doing. So I'm curious, maybe Dr. Allard and Dr. Landecker, how are we disseminating this kind of information outside of UCLA?
Hannah, do you want to take this, or do you want me go ahead? Yeah, I think it's through partnerships. I mean, this is why, again, the center is so important, because we need bridges. We can talk all we want in our ivory tower, but we need to get out of that ivory tower. So we need partnerships. These partnerships, a lot of us throughout our career, we build those, but then having a place like the center that we can aggregate all these partnerships that we create on our own and really consolidate them I think is absolutely essential. So in order to get out, I mean, through my work, it's been a lot of conversations with people at EPA. It's a lot of conversations with community people scientists, but who work directly with communities, talking a lot at conferences, sharing information, sharing knowledge. We've done it that way. I'm not a community scientist myself, but I need those partnerships. Without it, the work feels, I don't want to say useless, but it doesn't go as far as we'd like it to be. We're in this business to make a change, right? To make a difference. And so through these partnerships, we're able to disseminate that kind of information.
I would add that, I think you can't underestimate the education part of that comes last in the title, but it's a really central thing to think about. And as Dr. Clark really underlined, this is something that's really lacking at all kinds of levels. Fortunately, at UCLA, we have amazing undergraduates and graduate students, and they don't live apart from communities. They are part of California communities, of Los Angeles communities. And I can tell you that every day when I teach, I find that I'm engaging with someone who themselves is out there engaging in different ways. So I think the education piece is really tied into working with a larger audience than just the classroom. Even if you're in the classroom at first, it really hooks into a much larger set of audiences.
Thank you so much. And there was a question about whether graduate students are involved in the research that's happening that's affiliated with the center. And I think that answer is most definitely. All of you have graduate student trainees, and the center has a really, I think, a special place for graduate students to be engaged. There's a really excellent question about what we know about the effect of chemicals on fertility. One of the questions was specific to sperm quality and whether we have evidence. There's evidence of chemical effects. So maybe that's over to you, Dr. Allard. Do we have a working understanding of the interface between chemical exposure and fertility?
Yes, I think that's very clear. And it's there are many parameters that you can measure in terms of male fertility. There's the amount of sperm that's produced. There's also the quality. And unfortunately, both have been declining for a long time now. And, there's epidemiological data, and then there's the laboratory evidence. And the two need to go hand in hand, right? To really sort of confirm each other, build from each other. And the laboratory evidence is also very clear. There's many different types of chemicals, unfortunately, that can lead to decrease in sperm quantity and sperm quality. I referred to some of them already, like, for example, phthalates, endocrine disruptors, many different kinds actually can lead to the decrease. The problem is that in laboratory experiments, we often just work one chemical at a time. And in reality, we're exposed to, I know it's a weird term, but I often use it, a soup. It kind of feels that way. It's a landscape of chemicals that we're exposed to, a very complex mixture. And that's the part that we're still trying to figure out how to model that in a laboratory experiment to really mimic what we in the world are exposed to. And there's very strong inequity in terms of what we're exposed to. It's not one chemical environment. It's many different kinds of chemical environments. And unfortunately, people, for example, in the Central Valley of California, will have a much more complex, dangerous landscape. So really getting a handle on that, I think, is difficult. But there's so much evidence that I would say it's not a controversial question at all, that chemicals can indeed, unfortunately, lead to lower sperm quality and quantity over time.
And I think this is also really interesting as well, as Professor Landecker pointed out, is that we are starting families later. And so we're also, our cells and our bodies are the accumulation of chemical exposures. And so, not only are there certain chemicals that are impacting sperm quality and quantity, but also this gets worse over time with age. And so this is further, I think, exacerbated by the fact that we're that there's very clear evidence that we're starting families later.
I think what is so exciting to me is that these are questions that are so fundamental and profound to the way we live and have families and interactions. And they're just outstanding questions, and to be in a place that's on the forefront of asking them under the leadership of such fantastic scholars is really exciting. Another question that came up that I'm interested in hearing you address is, one of the pillars of UCLA is us being an environment that is really focused on equity and inclusion and thinking about how the work we do impacts different communities. And one of the questions that came out is whether your research will be focused and looking at the needs of marginalized communities as part of the center. And maybe I'll put that one to you first, Sander.
Oh, to me first. Yes.
Yes,
Well,
sorry.
there's been a very long history of certain groups being excluded as part of scientific discovery, and reproductive science-based research is a part of this as well. And so now I think, considering what Professor Landecker has talked about in her talk, and certainly the way we think in our lab, is that as we're designing experiments now, that we need to actually be taking into account the sort of experimental design that we're engaging in, such that it is inclusive of those individuals that we are trying to help in the science. The foundational knowledge that we create should be foundational knowledge for everybody, not just one particular type of group that's more engaged in the scientific process. So a really great example in the stem cell world right now is we're thinking very hard about how we can start to make stem cells from individuals who are not normally included in reproductive science research. So that way, as we're thinking about how do we make our reproductive organoids or other types of organoids, are we actually studying people from diverse backgrounds and representation? So this is happening at the level of the basic science. I think Hannah has probably more to say about this as well.
Well, I can piggyback on that by saying that in collaboration with Dr. Clark and led by postdoctoral fellow Anne Le Goff, we are making sure to also engage with and really go out and listen to the perspectives of potential audiences and patients and users who might be impacted by these technologies in the future, and really making sure that we're not just asking one group from the population to say what they think, but really engaging with many voices and trying to bring them to the table and bring them to the table not just at UCLA, but to the table in National Institutes of Health funded research, and make those voices very visible and included. So there's never just one way to do it. And I think, again, this kind of partnership across the different methodologies can really help in thinking about how not to just to do classic research about impacts far down the pipeline, but to really look at the bench and say, what questions should we be asking? Who should be involved in setting priorities? How should we design these questions to be responsive to our historical moment?
And I think that's a perfect way of rounding out the evening. I'm so excited about the work ahead, and so grateful to have the opportunity to work with such extraordinary scholars who are really thinking about how to serve our larger community here in Los Angeles and beyond. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation on reproductive science and health. We hope you've enjoyed it and have maybe learned something today that you'll take with you. I apologize that I didn't get a chance to answer ask all of the fantastic questions in the chat, but I think that just says that we need to join each other again for a conversation about the center and about reproductive science, health, and education. This webinar has been recorded, and we're going to send a post-event email with a link to the recording, so please feel free to share it with others. And we hope that you will join us again for our next Let's Talk Science event. Please keep an eye out for the invitation that will come from UCLA Life Sciences. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a lovely evening.